Novel Beloved, Toni Morrison writes that definitions belong to the definers, not to the defined. Definitions belong to the definers, not to the defined. It's a line that has been widely quoted, often to make a point about the arbitrariness of language, to make the point that a word means something just because people have decided it means something. The word dog, for instance, has nothing inherently to do with the furry, four-legged friends of ours. It's just that somehow we've come to an agreement that we'll all think of them when we hear the word dog. But in the context of Beloved, the novel, the line is not actually about definitions in the dictionary sense. It's about power. The character who says it is a teacher whose student has just challenged him using the teacher's own reasoning. The teacher is not pleased and is reasserting his power. I'll do the defining, he is saying, as he hits the student. Morrison's story is about people whose lives have been defined through violence by other people, former slaves who are struggling to become the new definers of their own lives. They need to find their power by becoming definers. It's a great line. No wonder it's been quoted so often. I think it's important to acknowledge its original context, even as we explore other ways to unpack it. I came across it recently in Brené Brown's book, Rising Strong, in which she tells a story that suggests yet another truth in this line, and that is that definitions reflect the definers. They do not reflect the person being defined. Definitions reflect the definers, and not necessarily the person being defined. In her book, Brown, who is a social worker, tells a story about encountering a really, really difficult person. Brown was speaking for a nonprofit organization that was covering her travel expenses on a tight budget, and so to save money, they had her rooming with a stranger. Now, I don't know about you, but she had me already right there. I know I look like an extrovert, but when I'm done being extroverted, I am like a turtle, just going into its shell, just leave me alone. And just the thought of sharing a hotel room with a stranger gives me some anxiety. And to top it off, I've got this persistent fear from growing up in a gritty, blue-collar neighborhood that I might not really know, or I'll forget the rules of polite society. You would think that spending time in graduate school at Harvard would have helped me out with that, but it actually just confirmed that there really are some social codes that I do not know. I sometimes felt like I had the word scholarship student written on my forehead. Has anybody here ever had that kind of feeling? Yeah. It's the persistence of those labels other people give us, like the ones some of the singers held up this morning while the band was playing Mike Posner's song, Be As You Are. Whether it's fat or stupid, feminazi, whatever it is. For me, a label was white trash, and those labels, those definitions stay with us. We can end up walking around worried that others are seeing them as though we're wearing the sign on our backs and we don't know it. So at the end of a long day, I don't want to worry about coming off as polite enough or in the right way. I just want to heave a sigh and go inward. Brown was also dreading the arrangement for her own reasons, and it turned out she did get kind of a roommate from hell. When she walked in the door, the roommate was already sprawled out on the couch with her dirty hiking boots up on the light beige armrest, where they were leaving a visible footprint. And she was eating a big, messy cinnamon roll. Her hands were covered in goo. As Brown put on her best face and greeted her, the roommate finished the cinnamon roll and wiped her hands across the couch twice and said with a shrug, it's not our couch. Brené Brown could not believe it. Then the woman proceeded to smoke a cigarette on the tiny patio, even though it was a non-smoking hotel. When Brown tried to get her to stop violating the policy, adding that the smoke was getting into the room, the roommate laughed and said, they didn't say anything about the patio, and we'll spray some perfume. Okay, that is not knowing the rules of polite society. Or maybe knowing and just not caring at all. Later, Brown told her therapist about it, about how unbelievably rude and annoying the roommate was. Her therapist listened for a while, and then she asked a provocative, maybe even ridiculous question. She asked, "Do you think it's possible that this roommate was doing the best she could that weekend?" "What?" "No," Brown told her. She fired back, asking the therapist what she thought. The therapist replied, "I'm not sure. I think that in general, people are doing the best they can. What do you think?" Brown was thinking of firing her therapist. But the question did stay with her. Did her therapist really believe that, she wondered? Or wasn't that just what she and the therapist were both supposed to believe because they are social workers? Were people generally doing their best or not? So Brene Brown started asking other people that question. Are people generally doing the best they can? She turned it into a research question. She's a researcher. And she conducted a study in which she polled people. Some people responded with an unequivocal yes. People are doing the best they can. Others said, no way. And this was interesting. They usually gave themselves as the first example. Brown started to notice that the people who said no tended to be the same people who struggled with perfectionism, as she puts it. Finally, one day she had a conversation with a friend that gave her pause. When asked whether people do the best they can, the friend, like the perfectionist, was quick to say no. And then she launched into a tirade. She gave breastfeeding as an example. She was breastfeeding her baby, and it had been hard, but she had persevered. Since breastfeeding is best for baby's health, she said she could not understand why any mother would choose not to do it, and therefore, she said, those mothers were not doing the best they could. Well, Brown, like so many mamas, had a personal experience of being unable, for physical or emotional or practical reasons, to breastfeed. This friend's judgment hurt a lot. Brown writes, I wanted to convince her that I love my kids as much as she loves her kids. I desperately wanted her to know that I did the best I could. But I didn't say anything because all I could think about were the people who, when I sat in judgment, probably wanted to say to me, you don't know me. When she got home that evening, her husband, a pediatrician, asked her how her day had gone, and she realized that although she'd spent a whole month on this question, she had not yet asked him what he thought. So before she shared the profound impact of her conversation, she asked him, do you think that in general, people are doing the best they can? She says he thought about the question for a solid 10 minutes, looking out the window. She knew that in his work, he saw all kinds of things, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And then he said, I don't know. I really don't. All I know is that my life is better when I assume that people are doing their best. It keeps me out of judgment and lets me focus on what is and not what should or could be. All I know is that my life is better when I assume that people are doing their best. It keeps me out of judgment and lets me focus on what is and not what should or could be. Wisdom. This is hard, though. Last week, we found out that my husband's identity had been stolen. There were fraudulent charges on our credit card and even a false lien against our home. Was the person who did that doing the best they can? I don't know. I don't know them. I cannot walk in their shoes. I do know that people behave in ways that might seem strange or even outrageous to others when they are scared, despairing, lonely, or living with chronic physical pain, hunger, or need. We behave oddly when we are living with anger, jealousy, resentment, regret, or shame. We have inner resources, limitations, and reasons for our decisions that only we know. Though none of us is alone and we are interdependent. The truth is, no one can walk in another person's shoes. I tell this story because judging others and self-judgment are closely linked. This is where Brené Brown lands after all of her exploring. She herself struggles with shame, vulnerability, and perfectionism. You've heard the phrase, peace begins at home. Practicing loving kindness toward others also begins by practicing it with ourselves. But that's hard for many of us. I think it's probably hard for most of us. We tend to be our own worst critics, and even when we seem to be criticizing others, when you dig down into the roots of it, it usually comes from a terrible fear of being unacceptable or unlovable and drawing those lines between ourselves and others in order to define ourselves on the good side of the line. In the mind of somebody who harshly judges others, there's not much room for personal failure. Having drawn such rigid lines, a judgmental person will go to great lengths to avoid confronting their own demons, so that when they find themselves in a painful situation, parenting a wayward child, or going through a messy divorce, or experiencing depression, it is all the more devastating. The facade of their self-definition crumbles. In the worst case, this leads to bitterness and resentment, but in the best case, an awakening and personal growth. This is what it means to say that definitions reflect the definers more than the defined. Judgmental definitions like weak or fat or white trash are more about the definer's need to feel strong, right, and good than about the person on the receiving end of that judgment, but still, their labels can cause some harm. Those who consciously strive to be non-judgmental are less likely to be dramatically blindsided by self-judgment, but they may still struggle to avoid internalizing the definitions of others. Your body is a miracle of energy sparking molecules into life, but some days all those airbrushed images in advertising get the better of you and you just feel dumpy. Or you are doing the best you can, but you struggle with a sneaking suspicion that it is not good enough, that maybe you are your own worst enemy. Maybe you're constrained by gender definitions. They get in your way. I think this is true for most of us at some point. For men, it can look like a deeply ingrained lesson that you are not allowed to feel vulnerable or express need or to fall apart, to confront your own vulnerability, or to find yourself in a place of deep emotional need can not only feel stressful or scary, but also shameful because it's not the behavior of a quote-unquote real man. But without permission to feel vulnerable and to explore a deep need, a man's personal development and his spiritual growth are blocked. It takes a lot of courage to give yourself that permission to become a definer for yourself, to allow the false definitions of manhood belong to the false definers and the real definition belong to the real you. For women, there's the problem of being told that we're supposed to be nice and self-deferential and thoughtful all the time. Many of us struggle to set personal boundaries or say no or take serious charge of our own lives without feeling shame, without the vague notion that we are betraying someone else somehow by taking the lead in our own lives, even our work lives. Becoming definers for ourselves is still a subversive act, even in this day and age. One of the problems with the gender definitions is that they reflect a binary, absolute version of gender that doesn't reflect reality anyway. We all have so-called masculine and feminine traits, and some don't identify with either gender, and some identify with a gender different than the one assigned at birth. It's good to question definitions, to ask, who is the definer here? And notice how fragile their defining has made them, how they are projecting their fear for all to see. Notice their spiritual unskillfulness. I learned that phrase in the course of studying Buddhism, a useful phrase. Poor or hurtful behavior often boils down to spiritual unskillfulness. Notice that. Not with self-righteousness. Don't be smug about it. Use the moment to cultivate compassion in yourself, even as you challenge them or reject their definitions or otherwise set your own boundaries. You also know what it's like to be spiritually unskillful. So do I. Oh boy, do I. We all do. We all find ourselves on both sides of the equation, sometimes being judgmental, sometimes being judged. Learning to be as you are, to accept yourself as you are, and therefore to be able to see others as they are without judgment is a deeply spiritual task. It's one of the most important things we have to do in our lives. And how are you? Well, since you're human, you're probably a lot of ways. Powerful, helpless, strong, vulnerable, beautiful, flawed, skillful, bumbling, wise sometimes, still learning at other times. Anyone who lives long enough will eventually learn what helpless, vulnerable, flawed, and bumbling really mean, and what it means to be still learning when you make big mistakes, consequential ones, at things or people that are important to you. When that happens, the crucial task is to stay present. Your low moments are so valuable. In an article called Brave Love, my colleague Peggy Clark writes, "Courage and compassion are byproducts of a heart that has been smashed." Courage and compassion are byproducts of a heart that has been smashed. But you've got to stay present to see what can grow out of your experiences. After all, to be is to grow. To be is to grow. Accepting yourself as you are doesn't mean you don't keep growing. It isn't about giving up. It's about making a conscious decision to ignore the projections of other definers and embrace who and what you really are, which, since you are a human being, means you are on a path of growth. A good starting point is by acknowledging that at any given moment, you probably are doing about the best you can. You're probably doing the best you can in light of the inner resources, knowledge, hope, confidence, support, and patience you have at that moment. Being as you are means accepting where you are and looking for the continually unfolding lessons, so that, as Maya Angelou says, when you know better, you do better. Some say that intellectual and spiritual growth is the purpose of a human life. I like to think more in terms of meaning than purpose. Growth is a deeply meaningful part of our lives. It's a core value of our liberal faith. Our principles speak of the free and responsible search for truth and meaning, and even before those words, they speak of acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations. Those are two of our 7 principles: the free and responsible search for truth and meaning, and acceptance of one another, and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations. Truth, meaning, acceptance, growth. Those are some of our core values. The interplay between acceptance and growth is a good place to pay some special attention. Are you practicing loving kindness toward yourself and others? Are you continuing to grow and to cheer others on in their growth? One of the most valuable things a church community can do is to provide a place where we are able to reflect on these things together and practice them and offer mutual encouragement. May we do so with big hearts.